update and profile ESXi hosts. All right, so we are now at the point where we have to start doing some of the configuration management tasks in our vCenter environment. And what's interesting is that ESXi, being a Linux-based operating system, in many ways actually makes these configuration management tasks a lot easier. Linux is very file-based in the composition of its OS. There's not really the sense of a registry there. So many of the configurations that you do, I mean, if you need to go change an IP address, for example, you're going to do so by changing a file somewhere. What this means is that the process of profiling an ESXi host is in many ways very simple. Now, even though the process is simple, what you need to have are some automations that sort of take all the different possibilities that you can use for an ESXi profile, so all those different configurations that are out there, automate the collection of them, and then present to you what is essentially, all right, this is the host as it's configured, and then allow you to then compare this host's profile, its configuration, with the other hosts on your system. Now, if you remember, I've said a few times already that when you're configuring ESXi hosts, there's a lot of these configurations that are very host-centric. And if I'm creating a standard switch, a standard vSwitch, I've got to create a standard vSwitch on this host, and I have to do the exact same thing with the exact same configuration on that host and that host and that host and that host. And if I don't do it correctly, well, I might end up with some host that, as virtual machines are moving around, they end up on a host that's not got the necessary configurations that it needs. So profiling your ESXi hosts is a very important step in maintaining your configuration control, because not doing so could mean that you don't have the right configuration that is cohesively applied across all of those hosts in your environment. Now, vCenter has this tool called host profiles, and it provides a mechanism for you to automate this whole configuration management process. And we'll talk about that in this nugget as well. We're going to create and work with some host profiles and then use them to perform compliance scanning and also remediation of different ESXi hosts. We're also in this nugget going to talk about the whole process of updating those hosts as well. So the tool in vCenter that you'll use in order to do this is the vCenter Update Manager. And we'll install the manager tool, we'll install the plugin, we'll work with some baselines, which is the mechanism by which it identifies what sorts of patches that you need, and then remediate those baselines and apply the patches. So let's actually spend some time then working in our old vCenter instance here. This is once again vc.company.pri, the whole vCenter instance we've been working with thus far. I got my 3 hosts here. I got my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 virtual machines that we've created so far. Now, I want to take a look at these 3 hosts because it's entirely possible that maybe I've not created all of my configurations the same. And if I didn't have some sort of automation tool, well, I'd have to click through all these different settings to verify, well, is everything indeed the same or not? One of the other tools that's available, as I mentioned, is this host profiles service, or this host profiles plugin that's available here inside of the vSphere client. Now, the first thing you have to do is arrive at this location and create a profile. I am going to create a profile from an existing host here, and that existing host is just simply going to be esx1.company.pri. The assumption here is that you have one host that you just absolutely know that you've configured correctly. And so what you want to do is you want to create that as sort of your golden profile, and you want to use that profile as the mechanism for validating the configuration of the other hosts that you're not quite sure of. So I'm going to call this my golden, G-O-L-D-E-N profile, if I can spell here this morning. My golden profile. Click Next, click Finish. Okay, this is going to go through that process of actually creating that host profile. So in the background now, it's actually going through all the different possible configurations as it relates to vSphere and creating a profile out of that. Okay, after a minute or so, it's complete. And I've got this golden profile here. If I take a look at the summary here, it's version 5. The created time and last modified time is set up here. I've got a little bit of information over here on the right about my authentication information, some network information, things like that. And then now I can use this profile to actually take a look at, well, where are my other machines perhaps not compliant? So I want to take this profile and I want to attach this profile to a host or to a cluster to see if it is indeed compliant. Let's attach to the cluster. All right, so now I have ESX1, 2, and 3, and the cluster itself that have been attached to my profile. And before I go there, however, what I want to do is show you what the contents of this profile are. Okay, what are all the pieces that make up that profile? So when I actually go to measure the compliance with this profile, what am I actually checking against? Well, do I have any memory reservation configurations in here? Do I have the storage configuration across, for example, NFS? Here's my NFS storage configuration with this NFS data store. And are all of these settings equivalent? Is my iSCSI initiator configured correctly? Here's my independent and dependent hardware iSCSI adapters, or the software adapter, which is the one that I'm actually using. There's the identification, the initiator selections setting here. Now, you can see that this gets relatively, well, it gets relatively deep. There's all kinds of settings in here that I am verifying one versus the other. So when I actually go through and attach this profile to this host or cluster, well, it's going to verify the compliance of that host to the profile. Now, obviously, if I create the profile based off of esx1.company.pri, well, I should find myself relatively compliant to it. However, you'll notice here that if I actually check compliance, that there's a little bit of difference here. The iSCSI adapter IQN on the system for iSCSI adapter vmwr33 does not match the one configured in the profile. So I know now that, well, I've got some sort of issue here with this profile as it relates to what the basic profile is. If I do the same thing and check the compliance against the other hosts, you'll see where other locations are that I may have created some problems. Oh, looky here. This is ESX3. So here are some interesting failures as it relates to ESX3 in comparison with 1 and 2. For example, I failed to turn on NTPD. The resource pool settings have changed. There are some expected user input parameters that are changing. So all of these are entries that I need to be aware of because they're different between the profile and what the host actually is. So with this information, I can then go and I identify, well, where have I made mistakes in my configuration? Identifying those mistakes is sort of just the first step in the process. The second step in the process is actually applying the changes that are necessary in order to bring myself back into compliance. So let's say I've got these non-compliant entries here, okay, and I need to bring them back into compliance. There are two things I can do. The first is an answer file. Now, the answer file kind of provides the input policy for how I would enter in information that's necessary in order to bring myself into compliance. You'll see this answer file includes information for the software iSCSI initiator selection configuration, and then also the IQN information and the alias information in here. If I want, I can then make modifications here to these values for what I want to apply, and click Update to actually update that answer file. The process to bring this host into compliance in an automated fashion is by ultimately applying my golden profile. Now, as you can imagine, you don't want to do this while the machine's running and its virtual machines are doing things. I don't want to go and change a configuration of a host while there's things actually operating. So if I try to apply the profile here, you'll see that the host needs to be in maintenance mode before that profile can be applied to it. So let's actually take this host and put it in maintenance mode. Now, this is going to move off the virtual machines to other hosts in the cluster. Maintenance mode essentially says, all right, I am prepared to actually do things to this host. I don't want it actually running virtual machines. I don't want it doing anything that's production workload. Go ahead and put it into maintenance mode. Okay, you'll see here that because it's in a DRS cluster, the virtual machines may need to migrate to another host. Remember earlier when I told you that when you're adding HA and DRS into your cluster, well, make sure that you have enough hosts available because things like maintenance mode will cause those virtual machines to need to get migrated elsewhere. So after a minute or two, you'll see that this host ends up switching itself into maintenance mode. Any virtual machines that were running on it have now been moved off. And so now I can actually apply the profile to this host to bring it into compliance. So it loads that profile in here. If I want to make any changes, I can do so. Again, this is just the answer file settings that I want to insert in here. If I want to change the IQN name or change the alias name for the adapter, I can do so. I'm not going to do so at this point. And then it will go and apply that profile to the host. And it will show you what configuration changes are about to be applied on that host. And then at the end of the day, you will end up with a host that is now configured appropriately to ultimately bring it back into compliance. This process takes just a second or two. Once it's done, the profile, or the host will be brought back into compliance, and now we're aware now that we have a host that is properly compliant with that host profile. There we go. This ESX3 is now compliant with the host profile, and I know that this host has been configured appropriately and is not going to end up causing problems as VMs end up working or moving on to this host. The last step in this process is to actually exit maintenance mode and move this host back into the mode where virtual machines can interoperate with it. Now, I mentioned in this nugget that there are actually two tasks for ESXi hosts as it relates to configuration management. The first is making sure that the hosts themselves have the right configuration, and the second is to make sure that they have the right set of patches and updates that are required to keep them secure. This second set of activities are done via the tool called the vCenter Update Manager. And this is not a tool, unlike host profiles, that is automatically available on your vCenter environment. You'll see here I brought the vCenter DVD, the vCP5 DVD up here, and you'll see that I have the VMware vSphere Update Manager tool. Just like before, this has the .NET 3.5 SP1 and Windows Installer 4.5 pieces of code or frameworks that are required as prerequisites. But I wanted to show you the installation here because there are a couple of settings here that are important to be aware of as you go through installing Update Manager and ultimately working with it in your environment. Many of the selections here are your basic installations, right? Approving the EULA, defining where it is that you want to store the files for this software. Now, this screen, however, is an important screen because it reminds you that Update Manager version 5 does not support patching VMs. In Update version 5, you can upgrade ESX4 hosts to 5, but not 3 or 4. So be aware of this because you're going to want to have, this is a tool that you will use for actually completing some upgrades, but only certain types of upgrades. Also, this version 5 no longer supports VM patching, so some of the functionality just isn't there. Now, there is a selection box down here at the bottom that says, okay, after the installation, go ahead and download the updates from the default sources immediately. These are the updates that you will ultimately apply to your ESX host. So unless you're in a secure environment where you need to separate this process out, it's generally a good idea to download those updates immediately. If I click the next button here, I need to connect in this Update Manager into my vCenter infrastructure. Now I can do so here, the VMware vCenter server information. I'm just going to plug in here my username and then my password and hit the next button. And the next step is to install the necessary database stuff that vSphere Update Manager requires. Now, again, just like before, in larger environments, I can use an existing database. In smaller environments, I can use a SQL Server 2008 R2 Express instance. We've got a small-scale deployment here, so it should be just fine. Do I have any Update Manager port settings for actually navigating outbound to connect to the upstream servers to pull down those patches? This is the IP address I want to use and the ports that I want to use that need to be opened. And if I have an internet connection and want to configure proxy settings, I can do so there. Finish up the installation, allow it to install, and that is the process of installing the vSphere Update Manager. I'm going to let this conclude and finish installing here, and when we get back, we'll take a look at vSphere Update Manager and how to use it. And we're back. All right, I'm back here in the vSphere client. I want to first go here to plugins once again, and you'll notice that I have an available plugin here for the VMware vSphere Update Manager extension, and I've got to download and install this. So you see I click it, and it's going to run that extension and install that plugin so that I can make use of the Update Manager client here within the vSphere client. So as you can imagine, there's really kind of two steps to this. The first step, what we did just a second ago, and now this second step to actually wrap in the client functionality, the plugin functionality, into our vSphere client. Once we're done, and once we've completed this process, you'll see here now, where did it go? Right here. The vSphere Update Manager extension is now a part of the vSphere client. We can make use of it here inside of this vSphere client. If I click over here in Inventory, and I go down here to Solutions and Applications, you'll see Update Manager. And right here is essentially the vSphere Update Manager. Now, the idea here is it's a little bit different if you're familiar with Windows and the WSUS approach to Windows. What we do here with Update Manager is we start by creating a baseline. Right? So we create this baseline of what the patch configuration should be for a host. And then ultimately scan the inventory and review our compliance with that baseline and remediate any hosts that we need to. Now, step one, obviously, is you got to download those patches and upgrades. Now, you'll notice that because we checked that box earlier, that download task has been started, and once we actually get completed with that, we get all the stuff downloaded, well, as you see here, the patch definitions have been completed, then we can go about creating those baselines and groups. But five-step process: download the patches, create attached baselines, scan the inventory, review compliance, and remediate is how you'll actually go about dealing with the patch needs of your ESXi hosts. Let's actually take a minute and step through this process so you can see how it works here. Here I have my baselines and groups. I have two baseline names that are created by default for critical host patches and then non-critical host patches here. If I want, I can create another baseline if I want. Let's just call this, our baseline. And it can be a host patch baseline, a host extension baseline, or a host upgrade baseline. You'll notice what's missing here from previous versions are the virtual machine baselines. In version 4, there was the ability for vSphere to actually inject patches into the individual virtual machines, and they're not really here anymore. So I want to focus here on just host patches, because these are the ones that you're going to want to apply to add additional functionality, but more importantly, to ensure that your hosts don't have any security vulnerabilities that would be fixed by making sure that you have the correct patches. So if I click the next button here, there is two different ways in which you would actually define that baseline. The first is by creating essentially a fixed baseline. You identify what patches you want to apply to your hosts. Okay, I want patch 1, patch 2, patch 3, and patch 7, and as long as those are deployed, then I'm fine. The other is this dynamic baseline that really, it takes metadata about the patches and applies patches based off of which metadata characteristics you're looking for. I'll start here with the dynamic, and then I'll go back and show you what the fixed is. So here with dynamic, let's assume that I want just VMware patches of critical importance, of security type, in any product that are, I don't know, on or after a year ago. What this would do is it would apply just what you see here, essentially those characteristics for the patches that you want to apply. Now you can also include certain patches that you want to exclude from what this baseline would be. So I don't know, maybe this update app patch I really don't want because I know it causes a problem, and this open LDAP patch causes a problem as well. If there are additional patches that don't necessarily meet the dynamic baseline, I can add those in as well. This creates that baseline. Okay, so this is essentially the baseline that we've created. Here are the characteristics. It's done in a dynamic fashion so that as new patches come in, if they meet the characteristics of our baseline, well, then they will automatically be brought into that baseline and later remediated when we go through the remediation step in this process. Now, a fixed, as you can imagine, I'm just going to skip past here to the fixed baseline, is literally just select the patches that you want. So simpler, obviously. There's 263 patches in the patch repository right now. Much more simple, however, well, it's a fixed baseline, right? So as things change, you're going to have to go and change the baseline as well. If you have very specific, very hard-line configuration control requirements and you need to get each individual patch approved, well, the fixed baseline may make more sense for you. If you're concerned about just getting the right patches on based off of criticality, well, then a dynamic baseline may make more sense for you. It's really, the decision is up to you. We also have to create a baseline group here. Okay, so in our case, this is going to be a host baseline group. I'll call this our baseline group to keep the same taxonomy here. But this baseline group is effectively, all right, what are the baselines that we want? Okay, there's an upgrade baseline. Is there a patch baseline? In this case, it'll be our baseline. Is there an extension baseline? And these would identify, all right, how do I collect these various baselines together so that I can deploy them as a single entity? This would make more sense, obviously, if I had an update baseline and an extension baseline and more things that are associated here. But baseline groups is essentially a meta container for the baselines that you would create. Now, once I have that, the next thing I have to do is actually go through and identify where my hosts are in relation to the baselines. So the first thing we need to do is actually attach this baseline to the cluster. Right, so I'm going to select our baseline here, and I'm going to attach that to the cluster. Now you can see here I have 3 hosts in the cluster. I have 3 that are known compliant. If I hit the scan button here, I can scan for patches and extensions, and it'll go through the process to verify whether or not each patch has been installed or not. Now because I'm running ESX version 5, most of these patches are version 4 in nature. In fact, if I go back to what all the patches are, we're going to see very much so a lot of 4.0 patches in the list. As we move towards ESX 5 being in production for a longer period of time, we're going to see more patches. So once I get through with attaching this baseline and scanning to verify whether I'm compliant or not, I have 2 settings down here at the bottom. I can either stage the patches, essentially download the specific patches to the hosts I select and then ultimately remediate them later, or I can just remediate those hosts if I want. So let's go through and presume that we're going to remediate things. All right, so I have a patch baseline here, our baseline. We're going to remediate host 1 here. If I choose next, this would be the location where those patches that would apply to this baseline would be. Now, again, there are no patches because there are just no patches for what this host is right now. But assuming that there were patches here, I could go into the next screen and identify when do I want to actually apply those patches. So for our cluster, do I want to apply the patches immediately, or maybe do I want to wait until tonight? And I'll apply those patches later on tonight. If I choose next, I can select how do I want to handle the maintenance mode associated with powering off this machine, powering it back on. Do I want to change the VM power state as I put things into maintenance mode? If there's a failure, do I retry maintenance mode? Do I disable any removable media devices? This last piece down here is particularly important because if you have removable media devices, physical devices that are connected to virtual machines on the host, those connected media devices can actually prevent the virtual machines from being migrated elsewhere. So you could come back in the next morning and your hosts aren't patched because a VM couldn't get moved to another host. So disabling those removable media devices can be important because, well, you want to be able to migrate those off the host. Do I also want to enable patch remediation of powered on PXE booted ESXi hosts? This checkbox here allows me to patch on things that may be deployed via auto deploy. If I choose next, a couple other options here. Do I disable DPM? Do I disable admission control? Remember earlier that when we created our HA cluster, we actually reduced down the amount of protection that we have. We're not protecting 33% of our available resources. We're only protecting 20% of those resources. So during this maintenance event, perhaps maybe do we want to disable admission control for just that period of time? Do I also want to disable fault tolerance? Do I want to enable parallel remediation if it actually does not impact the processing of workloads in my cluster? Do I want to migrate powered off and suspended virtual machines as opposed to just the powered on virtual machines? And then also, do I want to generate a report? Once I've done with all of these tasks, I hit the finish button. This will create the task to actually go about remediating this host and applying whatever patches are necessary. So really, this is kind of what you need to know as it relates to this whole process of keeping your hosts updated. I've got my patch repository here. I can identify any notifications that I want if I want to check for various notifications from those hosts. Here are some ESXi images and software packages that may be imported in for Update Manager if I'm doing upgrades, for example. Do I have virtual appliance upgrades that I want to take a look at? Do I also want to adjust any configuration settings here as far as the network connectivity or download settings for the different types of patches? Do I want to use a shared repository so I only have to download patches once and then use them across the different vSphere environments that I might have? I can adjust my download schedules and my notification check schedules, and then any virtual machine settings and host settings as well. So all of these present a really rich environment for you to manage keeping the right patches on those hosts. And I should mention too that it's dangerously common in virtual environments for administrators to just kind of forget about the process of keeping those hosts updated. An ESXi host has the same sorts of potential vulnerabilities that a Windows host would. And so if you're spending a lot of time worrying about your Windows virtual machines and their patch state, but you don't actually involve all of the necessary patches for security or otherwise for your ESXi hosts, you may be creating a security problem for yourself. So be conscious about that and make sure that you do work with vCenter Update Manager and create those baselines, and always make sure that you're patching to those baselines so that you can keep your hosts secure. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about updating and profiling those ESXi hosts and all the different patching requirements that you have to have. We work with both the host profiles functionality as well as vCenter Update Manager to really give you an idea of how to manage the configuration of your hosts to protect them against misconfiguration or whatever problems may occur, as well as the update configuration of those hosts to ensure best security. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.